Hi everyone! In this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a hedgehog in graphite. Now here, as you can see, this hedgehog is wearing a Christmas hat, and at the end of this tutorial I'm going to be adding some snow, and that's just because I wanted to create a Christmas themed tutorial for my Patreon channel, but definitely these elements could be left out and the hedgehog just drawn as it is. Now jumping straight into this here, I like to work on the eyes first and then I start building up the hair or the fur around it. Now as you saw there on that bit of paper, I was just demonstrating how best to use that pencil for this sort of fur texture. Now the key to drawing any realistic fur or hair is definitely the layers that we are putting in. So you want to start off with building up the general fur direction. That helps for us to then follow that reference photo accurately, and then I want to be focusing on my values. Now values and contrast is something that I talk about in all of my tutorials here on YouTube, and of course thoroughly in my real-time versions on Patreon. But the three main things that I'm focusing on here are pencil, the fur direction, the fur length and the fur thickness. Now how we use that pencil is going to be determining those three things. So how sharp the lead is, how long that pencil's in contact with the paper for, the amount of pressure that we should be applying to the pencil. All of those things here are going to have to be varied according to the animal or the instance, the texture that we're drawing. So for this situation where I'm blocking in the ear, you'll notice that I didn't jump in with my darkest graphite pencil first. I'm still building up those layers gradually. So as I continue to work on the rest of the fur here, you can really see how the fur direction has been so important from the very beginning. This is building up the shape of the face. Now the fur direction is not random, it follows the underlying bone and muscular structure. So anywhere where it has an obvious curve or it may have a dip, that there is going to be indicating at the structures underneath the fur that we are drawing. So around the eye socket, away from the cheek where it then joins onto the neck, all of these main structures here are indicated through the use of the fur direction. So this is something that I really want to be making sure that I capture accurately. Now the next thing is working with your erasers. The way that we lift that graphite off the paper is going to be determined in the way it has been applied. So if you're using your erasers and you're finding that they're not quite working the way that you would like, one of the causes can be that the graphite initially has not been applied in the right way. So the graphite is really stuck to that paper, so the erasers have a harder time to lift that off. Now this is something that I do cover thoroughly in the real-time versions on Patreon, and the way that we can use those erasers effectively here to create those nice fine highlights can really help to add extra depth and realism to our pieces. Now the left side of the face is not finished. I will come back and add some more highlights and some details, but for that stage I was happy with where it was for the time being. So I decided to work on the other side. Now as you can see, with that first layer of graphite powder, I'm mapping in my main lights and darks. But what's key and really important with that layer is there are no harsh start and stop points. If you have those harsh edges early on, it can be really difficult to then cover that up and get that softness in the fur. So by having that initial layer blended, it's just going to help to build up that softness right from the very beginning. Now as I continue to work with my pencils here, again the fur direction is something that I focus on right from the start. And as I start to build up the ear here, this did have a few more highlights compared to the other side of the face, so I'm just coming in with my putty eraser to remove some of that graphite. Now this brings me on to the lighting. The light source here is really important. So if you're working from a reference photo with a strong one-sided light source, it's really important to make sure that you're paying attention to how bright your highlights should be in that area and how dark your shadows should be. So on this side, the right side of the face that I'm currently working on, that side was lighter than the other side. So I had to make sure that I am either removing more of the graphite or I don't put as much graphite down to start with, and therefore I am already hinting at that light source from those early stages. But as I've mentioned, the ear on this side, it does have those subtle highlights that the other ear doesn't have. Once this hedgehog is finished, those subtle highlights on the ear, the fact that the fur around the eye is a little bit lighter, all of these things are going to play a huge role in the overall light source of the entire portrait. Now when it comes to working on the muzzle area or the bridge of the nose of any animal, this is usually where the fur length is going to massively change. So quite often here I'm speaking about the importance of fur direction, and that is still important here, but the one thing that's more noticeable is how short my pencil strokes are compared to everything else so far. If I keep my pencil strokes here the same length, I'm going to make this fur on the nose look really long and fluffy. So for this animal, that isn't right. I have to be making sure that I'm adjusting that pencil technique as I go, depending on the area of that animal that I'm working on. Now again, I'm reinforcing my shadows here, building up my layers gradually and reinforcing that light source. The fact that the chin would cast that shadow, I'm going to come back and actually make some of the left side of the face darker to reinforce my contrast even more. Now something that I talk about in this real-time version on Patreon is how to create those fine lines with a Tombow mono eraser, which is the eraser I was using here, and then how to create that softness. There is a real balance between getting your harsher eraser marks in place but then going back in and making sure that they are the right texture. You don't want super fine lines to the point where it looks wiry on this sort of animal. If I was drawing a border terrier where that fur is more coarse, then that wouldn't be so much of a problem. But if you are creating your fine highlights, there are so many cases where we need to go back in with our graphite pencils or our softening tools to push those highlights back. Now for the hat here, this is all about shading. There are no real details. So I wanted to be focusing on the way that the lights and the darks transition from one to the other. So again, there are no harsh edges apart from on that seam where the edge of the hat is. The actual fabric itself, it is nice and soft. The transitions from light to dark are smooth. Now for my base layer there, I'm actually using an eye makeup applicator to apply my graphite powder, and that gives me that initial softness right from the very beginning. You can of course use your graphite pencils for your base layer, but I just find the graphite powder is easier and it's definitely far quicker. Now for this section of the tutorial, this is where I wanted to focus on the body, and this is where the techniques did vary, but I used all of the same tools. Now for the body of this hedgehog, I hadn't at this point drawn a hedgehog in graphite before, but I did have a plan in mind for how I wanted to tackle the spines. Now for this here, I still started with my graphite powder, but I wanted to hint at some of the spine direction. The way that it curves over here was very important, just like the fur direction. Now this hedgehog, being that it is like sort of bunched up and it's on its back, the way that the spines here were curved over is going to help to form the shape of the body. So I wanted to be making sure that I've got every single one of the curved of the spines accurate. Now this really does help to reinforce that appearance of this hedgehog being on its back and all curled up. So this here was one of my main focuses. But I'm building up my layers gradually, and as you can see, as I'm doing that, I'm reinforcing the contrast. My lights and my darks are everything for me in terms of working with graphite, but also my colour-based mediums. One of the questions that I'm asked when I work with pastels or acrylics is, how do we know which pencils to select, which colours we should choose from the reference photo? Now this is a great question, but if the exact colour was important, then graphite wouldn't look realistic because there's no colour at all. But we're focusing on the values, the lights and the darks of that colour. It's that which makes an artwork look realistic and three-dimensional. So as I continue to build up the spines here, again, I'm just following that fur direction, making sure to hint at that as accurately as I can. Now this was only a small project, it was 6 by 8 inches. Now the reason I've decided to do it this size is because I wanted to create these Christmas themed tutorials for my Patreon members to draw along, and they could then turn their version into a Christmas card if they wanted to, which is why I did go ahead and add the hat and the snow. But I wanted to be making sure that despite that, and it was a fun project to create, but I still wanted there to be a high level of photorealism. So I wanted to show how to draw the spines, how to draw this realistic, very cute animal, but still to a really high standard. And that's why I like to provide this layout and also the layout without the hat and the snow. So Patreon members can draw along to just more of a natural hedgehog portrait, or they can add the festive themes with the additional layout that I created if they wanted to. Now the one thing that's really important when drawing hedgehogs is that we don't want to be trying to draw in every single spine. Now I had a little research on Google. An average hedgehog has between 5,000 and 7,000 spines on their body. If we try to draw in every single one, it's just going to look a little bit of a mess. So this is one of those times where you just want to go for close. You want to make sure that you've got the direction of the spines right, you've got the thickness of the spines right. Again, here I've got a big variety with how wide or narrow they are. And then you want to be making sure that you've got about the right number. So I obviously haven't got 7,000 here, but I've got enough to hint at the fact that there are a lot. So having that balance between those three things is what I'm going to be focusing on while I build up my layers. Now again, just like what I've mentioned earlier on in this video, the softening techniques are also important. So there were a little bit more of like an outer focus feel for some of these sections of the spines on this side of the body. So once I put in my highlights, I wanted to then come back in with either my pencils or a paintbrush just to soften those out even more. Now when I work with my highlights, it's not just about trying to get it back to the white of the paper, because if I needed a highlight to be as bright as that, I would allow the white of the paper to show through from the very beginning and then draw around those highlights. But here, it's all important about noticing, is it actually white? Is it a really, really bright highlight? Because quite often that's very rarely the case. Now one thing that can happen when you are creating your graphite portraits, if you create a tonal swatch, so you have your reference photo and you actually drag out those grey shades, you can clearly see compared to white how dark they need to be. Now that's something there that can be really useful, and I do show examples of those on my Patreon tutorials. I've got a rose tutorial there where I've actually provided the tonal swatch, so you can see that there are so many different shades that we need to use, and when I've compared that up against a white, there was no sections of that rose that was actually white, and this was the case here with the hedgehog as well. Now when I came to working on the foot, my biggest tip here, if you're drawing any foot, fingers, whatever it may be, even for a human portrait, is don't imagine that you're drawing fingers. Just focus on the shapes that you see through your highlights and shadow placement. So here, because I was just focusing on where they were in my reference photo and drawing it in that way, this came together as a foot far quicker. If I'd have initially thought to myself, right, I'm drawing a foot, I need to draw in each individual toe, it probably wouldn't end up looking like a foot, or it wouldn't be as realistic as it does when finished. Now another thing that you can do if you're working on something that you're finding a little bit more challenging, you may be a bit confused by what you should be drawing, turn your reference photo and your artwork upside down, because your brain will be forced to see the abstract shapes rather than in this case a foot. So that can be one thing that makes a massive difference. Now at this stage here, I'm just adding those final highlights, so you want to be leaving any hairs that overlap everything else until the last layer, and that's when also I'll be working on adding the whiskers. Now quite often the whiskers are the very last thing that I add because they do overlap everything else, but in this situation for this portrait I then wanted to add the snow in. Now the snow would be sitting on top of everything else because obviously it's going to be snowing in front of that animal as well. So here I'm just going to be taking my erasers and just removing that graphite to create the impression of individual snowflakes. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos here to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. Here is a photo of my finished drawing, and if you would like to draw along to the real-time version on Patreon, then I'll link that all in the description below. If you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And one thing that I just want to mention about Patreon is it's really flexible, so you can stay for as long as you like or you can cancel at any time. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will be uploading another video here to YouTube at the end of the week.